Welcome to your own home or office and this first dialogue on a series of two initiated by the Green MENA Network. My name is Fadhel and I'm the correspondent for Dutch media in Tunisia. I would like to thank the network and especially Silva and Vanessa for initiating this dialogue on food sovereignty, a topic very close to my heart. The network aims to promote knowledge sharing and establish partnerships within and outside the region. It's both an honor and a joy to guide you to this next hour with two transformative speakers. Fadhel Kaboub and Mohsen Kalboussi will provide answers to all questions about food and your diet, including the ones you should have asked. They will puncture myths. They will leave you craving foods you did not know existed. You will start reconsidering your foods and your own diets. For some, it will involve a complete revision of their perception of Europe and its history. You are entering a war zone, according to a website, Euroactive, which published an article, Food Sovereignty is in the Heart of a Political War. The the COVID pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, aggravated by economic environmental issues, revealed fundamental flaws in our economic system and trade relations. The COVID pandemic, the European Commission launched the Farmer to Fork strategy as part of the Green Deal in 2020. The starting point for this strategy is the idea that agriculture and food systems are key drivers of climate change and environmental degradation. It is, as Fadhel Kaboub will elaborate, striking and perhaps telling that the Commission employs the term food security and not food sovereignty. Food security often um, is often understood as security of supply. Food sovereignty, on the other hand, includes a geopolitical dimension relating to reconsideration of self-sufficiency, import independence, diversification, as well as self-determination. In this context, it's notable that France and Italy renamed their ministries of agriculture and food to include the notion of food sovereignty. Anyway, European and national politicians suddenly made a U-turn following farmers' Europe-wide protests. The electoral gains of the far right in the European elections a fortnight ago bode ill for the strategy. As far as Tunisia, President Zayed so far proved powerless to adequately address the country's huge budget deficits combined with rising grain prices and persistent droughts. Citizens have now been plagued by food shortage and price hiking for over 2 years. Countless farmers have become unemployed. All of this will explored by our speakers over the next hour. Although the discussion centers on Tunisia, most of it is also applicable to other African countries. We will have two introductions of about 15 minutes, followed by space for questions. And please submit your questions via chat. And again, keep in mind that the conversation will be recorded. So if you don't want to be on video, turn your video off. And please don't forget to mention the question to whom the questions is addressed. Now I will give the floor to Fadhel Kaboub. Is an associate professor of the economics at Dimension University and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He currently serves as the Undersecretary General for Financing for Development at the Organization of Educational Cooperation in Addis Ababa, and Fadhel is also one of the driving forces behind Power Shift Africa. The floor is yours, Fadhel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation, Fayrouz and Green MENA Network. It's a pleasure to be here And thank you for hosting this very important conversation. There's often confused and confusing, despite being one of the most important issues for Tunisia and for the global South in general, for Africa in particular. So I'll start with some opening remarks, just highlighting some key concepts and key issues that we must understand so that we can frame the conversation in the right direction. The first thing I want to highlight is that the issue of lack of food sovereignty happens to be one of the main sources of external debt for Tunisia and for the global South in general. At the continental level in Africa, according to UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the last data report we have on this issue is telling us that Africa today imports 85% of its food. When you go back less than 100 years ago, you will immediately recognize that Africa used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers, major producer of food globally, a very rich continent in terms of agricultural land, arable land, and water resources. Yes, we've had the impact of climate change and droughts and desertification and so on, but that is not the reason for this structural deficiency. The main reason for the structural deficiency can be traced back to the early days of independence on this continent, starting with a meeting in Rome, one of the building blocks of the European Union, as a matter of fact, where the European countries at the time met and discussed the fact that they need to restore their food sovereignty, that they're so dependent on the former colonies or colonies at the time for their food security. And that started a series of conversations and a process that eventually culminated in the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is a basic pillar of the European Union to this day. So the Common Agricultural Policy is essentially an agricultural subsidy system to restore food sovereignty in Europe, to make sure that Europe can produce the core crops of wheat, barley, corn, rice, soybean, and so on, the core crops. And of course, this wasn't just Europe. This was similar to the process that was happening in the US with agricultural subsidies in the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and of course, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine today also are some of the key producers of these core crops. Now, what was the impact in the global South, in Africa, in Tunisia also? The impact was directly displacing farmers that used to produce wheat, that used to produce corn, that used to produce barley. They couldn't compete with the cheaper imported wheat from the subsidizing countries, from Europe, from Russia, Ukraine, the US, and so on. So what are farmers to do when they can't compete? The most obvious thing they resorted to, because their governments were not subsidizing them to match the subsidies from the global north, they had to switch to cash crops for exports. So instead of producing wheat and barley and corn, you start producing more coffee, more tea, more tobacco, more cocoa, more tomatoes and strawberries and bananas for exports, because those are supplementary, complementary crops. And the more you do this, you transition to the current system, which is when where we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. And with the introduction of this reorganization of the global food system comes the concept of food security, which on the surface of it, it sounds great. I mean, who doesn't like food security? Of course, we want food security, except that this is a loaded technical term that doesn't mean what you and I understand when we hear food security in the colloquial sense of the term. Food security means you secure the nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself, or by buying it from abroad, or by borrowing money, to be more precise, to buy it from abroad, which is what we typically do these days, or worse than that, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers, to your agriculture, because nobody can compete with free food donated from abroad as charity. So this is exactly what happened in the early 1960s. And as we transitioned to the concept of food security rather than food sovereignty, we started digging ourselves deeper into an external debt problem. In the 1960s, many countries, including in Tunisia, experienced what you can describe as mini crises, mini famines, mini food supply disruptions that were immediately, fixed with food aid from USAID, other places. Of course, it ended up in being famine in some countries, but for the most part, most countries were quote unquote rescued with food aid. And food aid was the last coffin in the nail of food sovereignty in Tunisia and the global south. There's another dimension that's extremely dangerous, and now today we're facing the consequences of the damage that was done with this process, which is an ecological damage that translates into food insecurity and degradation of the quality of the soil and so on. When you start rearranging your agriculture to prioritize exports of cash crops, then you start thinking about the taste of your consumers, right? And the global north typically. What do they want to consume? And you gradually start bringing in non-native crops that you can plant and export. Non-native crops that cannot adapt very well to your climate, to your droughts, which means crops that need irrigation rather than the rain-fed agriculture that we typically have in most of the continent, especially in Tunisia. So you need water irrigation infrastructure. You need to bring in fertilizers, that is importing fertilizers for those crops, and importing pesticides so that whatever you're producing can survive the journey all the way to supermarket in Geneva or Germany or whatever. So all of that is imported inputs. And the logistical infrastructure for export-oriented agriculture means it's very energy-intensive infrastructure. The infrastructure itself is imported, but it's also energy-intensive for transportation, refrigeration, and so on. So your agriculture turns into more extractive industry than self-sufficiency, self-sustaining type of agricultural system. And then you have the process of cash crops for exports with this infrastructure, with the water, fertilizers, and pesticides used. It means that after 20, 30, 40 years of doing this to your land, you end up killing the fertility of your soil, especially when you do this on an industrial scale, monoculture. When you kill the fertility of your soil, you have an economic problem. And now what do? You have to double down on using more potent seeds, more potent fertilizers, more potent pesticides. And that becomes, the vicious cycle of shooting yourself in the foot. And you fast forward to today, and that's how you get an entire continent importing 85% of its food, right? Which is the case of the African continent. The other thing that you end up doing is you double down in terms of cultivating more acreage, right, to make up for the decline in yields. So you move to burning the next, piece of land next door, and you do this systematically. The other thing I want to make sure we highlight, because this is a global phenomenon, this is not just in Tunisia or in Africa, and I want to get the numbers straight, so I'm looking at my notes here. What happened in the last 100 years or so is that we as humanity, we moved from a system, an agricultural system, a food system, where we used to have 30,000 edible plant species that, humanity used to consume, very diverse, non-monoculture type of system, where we had, traditionally harvested 7,000 species of food, 7,000. We now move to today's world, where we basically have a system where 60% of our diet, Globally, in Africa, Tunisia is very similar. 60% of our diet is based on 3 crops only: wheat, corn, and rice. So we go from that diversity of nutrition sources to a system where 3 crops dominate our diet. 90% of our nutrition comes from 20 plant species, 20 alone, from 7,000 down to 20. So this is, of course, not just an economic problem, not an international trade problem, not an ecological problem. This is, clearly a biodiversity crisis that we're dealing with, and a biodiversity that's affecting us as humans, our nutrition, our health, and so on. So how do we dig ourselves out of this mess? The solution, as most of the literature makes very clear, is strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, not food security, food sovereignty. So food sovereignty means you engage in a very intentional process of paying attention to the entire production process, from the seed all the way to the final consumer. And to restore the level of biodiversity, or at least some level of biodiversity, it takes, as they say, all hands on deck, which means it's not just the government and the subsidies and the nutritionist and the scientist and the agricultural sector per se. It also takes popular culture, because we can produce these crops today, we can rescue some of these crops, but we don't even know how to cook them. We don't know how to use them. You serve them in restaurants, nobody will touch them, right? So we need an entire sort of cultural revolution, using all the social media influencers, all the sports influencers, right? All the health influencers, to restore a culture of nutrition that is much more diverse than, relying essentially exclusively on 3 crops. And that takes strategic planning on a national and global scale. That means you start with education. You're not going to convince, people in their 60s and 70s to, start tasting new dishes and new, food habits. It takes, yes, some of that can happen with, older generations, but you have to build it from the ground up, starting with the younger generation, starting a new sort of gastronomy culture where we can actually value, right, this nutrition and taste that we've lost as humanity, but also value it economically, so that you actually create the market that will incentivize the cultivation of a new agroecology and biodiversity basis for agriculture, because you have to get the economics straight. It's not enough to just subsidize everything and incentivize from a push factor. You have to get the consumers on board, and that's all of us. So I wanted just to start the conversation with just these few, hopefully provocative thoughts about the problems and how they were created, how all of us participated in the creation, and how all of us need to be involved in the strategic transformation. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Fadhel. Thank you very much. The floor is now to Mohsen Kalboussi. He's an environmental scientist and publicist. His several very worth-reading articles are published by Nawat's platform, and I really recommend to search the platform on internet. So, Mohsen, please.
Okay. Thank you, Fayrouz, and thank you for all the attendance of this meeting. So we'll start about fruit export in Tunisia. Next slide, please. Next slide. I cannot. Okay. The first information is that about 80% of organic produced food in Tunisia are exported, and the main exported products are citrus fruits, dates, wines, olive oil, fish products, tomatoes, and other fruits. As for citrus products, the main client of Tunisia is France, which imports about 90% of all the Tunisian oranges. Okay, as for dates, we have two main clients for which dates are exported. The first one is the European Union, and the second is Morocco, with more or less fluctuation between years. About olive oil, globally, Tunisian consumers consume about 40,000 tons of olive oil, which is less than, actually it is about 30,000 tons, which is less than the needs of our society. The evolution of national exports shows clearly that most of the olive oil produced in Tunisia is exported. So the data shows that about 373 in 2020, for example, 373,000 tons of olive oil was exported, while at the same time, 10th of this quantity. Europe is the main client of olive oil exported from Tunisia, with more than 66% of about fishery products. Tunisia exports parts of its fishery products mainly to Italy, Spain, and Malta, which are European countries. Sun-dried tomato is also a product exported from Tunisia, mainly to Europe and from Europe. The main client of Tunisia is Italy. Other fruits are so as you may see here, I put in bold all the fruits which are very water consuming products, like watermelon, melon, strawberry, pomegranate, and grape. And Europe imports about the third of this of these fruits, and also there is another market which Tunisia exports is these fruits, which is Libya. Libya is economically, its economy is based a lot of water consuming fruits produced here in Tunisia exports mainly to an African country, which is Congo, and also to the United States and Japan, but marginally to Europe. It's about the fifth of the national of the volume exported from the country. Okay. The main imports are cereals, vegetable oils, and sugar. So the main conclusions from the data presented here are the following. First is that agricultural production is directed towards foreign markets rather than meeting society's needs, which joins one of the conclusions presented by the previous speaker. Export of water-intensive products, with the exception of olive oil, because producing olive oil does not need a lot of water. Even actually, most of the olive varieties planted in Tunisia are water dependent. Tunisia suffers from a lack of water, which is rationed for consumers. This is a paradox. While we produce and export highly consuming water products, people are in need of water. Priority is given to exports at the expense of local needs, as in the case of olive oil, because the society needs of olive oil are much more than the amounts consumed by people, because priority is given to export, and the prices of olive oil practiced in local markets are very high. Working conditions for farm workers are among the most difficult. In which the wages are very, very, very low. Working hours, they work for long periods of the day, and the main working forces here are women. Transportation conditions are very, very hard, and a lot of accidents with many deaths of these women take place each year. Europe is the main market for Tunisian products, which is evident because Europe is our actual and past colonizer. The debt problem forced the country to seek foreign currency to honor its commitments. This is one of the main, I think, explanations for orienting agriculture to export. Fruit exports and other products benefit exporters and intermediaries. It makes almost no contribution to the country's development. Export agriculture follows an extractivist model, which consumes a lot of water and inputs and marginalizes traditional agriculture. Okay. So the second part, please tell me when I have to stop, Ferouz.
Yes, I will. Please continue.
Okay, thank you. About neglected fruits, this part will be much more informative to those people attending this meeting. I will talk at first about Kaboub tree. Many people may know the fruits. The Kaboub tree is a native species in Tunisia. It also lives in uh, warm areas in the country, and it exists globally in very low densities. The fruits are consumed either by people and also by livestock. Actually, there is a need for the global market to Kaboub tree fruits. So there is an intensification of producing Kaboub fruits from the country as an alternative to the aspartame, which is the sugar used in by industrials. And those promoting this is something which has to be said. Those promoting Kaboub planting in Tunisia are mainly not national NGOs. Wild hackberry, Rubus unifolius, for those who are accustomed with Latin names, which is Rosaceae. It's the family of Rosaceae. It is a shrub which has very... Next slide, please. Okay, these are the fruits of this shrub and its flowers. The fruits are like mulberry fruits. They are very, very sweet and are mainly consumed locally by people and by shepherds. This fruit is not sold on the markets, but it is I think it is very rich in vitamin C. The other page 22, please. The other plant is the azeroli. Maybe many people may know it because its fruits are sometimes sold on markets, which are more or less small. With their diameter is about 3 to 5 centimeters, and they are yellow. They are sold by October mainly in the capital, and the fruits are the tree is not cultivated, but it exists. It is native of our flora, and its fruits are very sweet in consumption. They are very liked by people, and it is recommended as a medicinal plant. The third or fourth plant is the myrtle. Maybe some of you know it. The myrtle has many many uses. It is used in pharmaceutical as a pharmaceutical plant, mainly for aesthetics, for the hair and also for the skin. Its fruits are like small olive fruits, and it exists mainly in fresh forests and in the northwest part of the country. And globally, the children, when they go to school, they take small parts of the plant, they cut it and consume the fruits. Then when they finish consuming these fruits, they cut another part of this plant, and by this way they consume large parts of these fruits. Besides these fruits are also consumed by mainly by birds. It is not sold on the markets. Okay, here the page 28, you may see an industrial way of extracting of distillating this plant in order to produce oil for pharmaceutical industry abroad, which means that these products are exported. And the way of exploiting the plant is very harmful to its maintenance in its natural habitats. And actually, we are living a depletion of many parts of this plant in the country, mainly in the northwest of Tunisia. The other plant is the Arbutus inido. Maybe some of you know it because it is a tree or a shrub with an ornamental interest. It is very nice. Its fruits are consumed by the end of the year, between October and December. They are red and they taste very sweet. Actually, it is sold in some local markets in the parts of the country where it is produced, mainly in the northwest of Tunisia.
Could you please
Okay.
Sorry.
I will finish by the shrub Ziziphus lotus. Maybe some of you know it because it is a very large shrub living mainly in arid areas, and its fruits are locally consumed by the end of August. It is not sold. It is sold in some local markets by children. But it may be a potential with potential interest for consumers. Thank you for your attention, and excuse me for my not my very fluent English. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, then I will, then there is now space, about 15 or 20 minutes to ask questions to both speakers. If you have a question, then you can use the chat. And I will start to give everybody equally the floor. Maybe I could start myself with the first question to Fadhel. Because I think you forgot to mention the successes of food security policy, such as a sharp drop in death from malnutrition. Could that have also been achieved by, well, your proposition, by food sovereignty strategy?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely correct. The disruption I don't know if you can hear me, the disruption of the food system, global food system that happened in the 1950s and 60s, as I mentioned earlier, did lead to famines and mini famines, and of course, when I say mini famines, it's a sanitized term for saying lots of people ended up in situations of hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. But it's not just the agricultural system that led to structural lead to economic disruptions that affect food insecurity. And a big, source of that is the external debt, which is related to energy deficits in the global south, because no country can function without food, without energy. Energy is critical for transportation, for irrigation, for public health, and so on. But also the global economic architecture that further reinforced the colonial role of the global south as the place for cheap raw materials to be extracted for the industrialized world, as the place that consumes industrial output from the global north, as in our large consumer markets, and more specifically, more importantly, as the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is to the global south to be assembled with low cost labor, for under the label of development and cooperation, but effectively it locks the bottom of the global value chain with a manufacturing base that produces low exports for high value added content. And you have a systemic structural trade deficit that eats up your fiscal policy space year after year and forces in defense economic policy, because with the trade deficit, your currency becomes higher at a higher real cost, which means we import inflation in the most sensitive areas, food and fuel and medicine. And the defensive mechanism that countries like Tunisia have used since then is to subsidize food, subsidize fuel, subsidize medicine, which makes sense to protect the most vulnerable. You're not the roots of the problem. We have food subsidies in Tunisia, subsidizing the producers in the global north from whom we purchase agriculture. We're not subsidizing Tunisian farmers. So you end up subsidizing your imports, right? So when you have that kind of defensive mechanism, the second part of the defensive mechanism is what central banks do, which is trying to defend the exchange rate, to stabilize the exchange rate. And we more dollars into the external debt crisis. Have external debt accumulating year after year, decade priorities are real to prioritize export-oriented activity, including cash crops for exports, including all the extractive industries. They prioritize dollar revenues to allow you to buy the food at the end of the month, to allow service the debt. And that becomes the structural trap. And of course, when you do that, we neglect the building blocks of development and prosperity, including health and nutrition and infrastructure, let alone all the climate priorities and the other priorities that we deal with today. So all of these are interlinked. Today, our focus was on the food part. And yes, it's related to hunger and malnutrition, but there's an entire system behind it, that history, that links to energy, that links to external debt, that forces what some economists, including Tunisian economists in the past, used to refer to our economy as an economy that is, a country. We have our flag, our president, our parliament, but our economy is abroad. Our national priorities are steered from abroad. And when you have non-democratic intervention from external steering your economic, of course, you end up with hunger and malnutrition and all the consequent system of economic structurals of which the food system is a component. Very good question.
Okay. Thank you. Then now I have a question for Mohsen. Could you tell us a little bit more about the farmers? Are they mostly Tunisian farmers, or are most big companies led by foreign, for example, European farmers?
I did not hear you because my connection is not good, but I will try to respond to two questions. It is the first one is from Silva. It's about those who own the land here in Tunisia. As you may know, the French colonization was an agricultural colonization. So after 1956, the date of independence, there is a law in Tunisia which forbids to foreigners to own lands in the country. In the last decade, Islamists tried to erase this law to allow to foreigners to have access to land, but it did not pass. So those producing for external markets are mainly Tunisians on a land of Tunisians, but the actors may be transnational companies or some external actors, like what's happening, for example, in Gabis, where some people from the Netherlands produce tomatoes with warm waters in winter, or in Gafsa, for example, where many hundreds of hectares are used to produce salads, organic salads to Great Britain. The other question is for both of you, who are your most important partners to make strategy for achieving food sovereignty and biodiversity? Is it NGOs, farmer corporation, cooperatives, your own government? Okay, there is already a network dealing with specifically with food sovereignty, but in the MENA region, from Lebanon to Morocco, with many actors involved within, and they try to respond to some of the main keys of food sovereignty in our region, but their main activity is to expand the knowledge or the information about and history about social movements engaged in food sovereignty in the region. NGOs are so weak to propose alternatives, at least for the moment. But linkage between, for example, academics and NGOs may erase alternatives to the official or formal policies related to food sovereignty, but globally to energy, to climate change, and a lot of actors. But the political situation actually is not adequate, if you like, to deepen many aspects of these topics, and people tend to be much more silent and to accept what the government decides in the country. Thank you.
Okay, there is another question for Fadhel. It's Rav Kifi, and he says, governments claim normally that they need to export food because of economic needs for currency for development. What's your response to that?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, very good question. It is a circular argument that that governments use when they don't have a strategic vision for getting out of that trap. And what I mean by that is that we have, um, if you think of, you know, investing in producing, say in Tunisia this year, this agricultural season, we can actually dedicate a little bit of our productive capacity to cultivate and produce 1 additional metric ton of wheat in Tunisia. And instead of 1, let's do 100. It's a very small amount. So imagine the equivalent of 100 metric tons of wheat produced domestically saves us the equivalent of dollars and euros that we had to borrow to import that wheat from abroad. And interest we had to pay on that debt for 10 plus years at least, right? So every metric ton of domestically produced wheat, core crops, right, saves us the equivalent in dollars we had to borrow and interest we had to pay for the next 10 years, right? And this is completely feasible within 1 agricultural season, right? And as we rearrange our priorities, because currently what we do as part of, you know, quote unquote, our agricultural policy, which is really not our agricultural policy, it's the agricultural policy that's been assigned to us by, say, the European Common Agricultural Policy. Our current priorities is to use the most fertile soil that we have in Tunisia and the most precious, scarce water resources to prioritize producing watermelon and strawberries for exports, right? Not for our food security. And at the same time, struggle to borrow money and pay interest to import wheat from the Ukraine, from Russia, from the European Union and other places. So that is the most flagrant misallocation of resources that we have in Tunisia. And the solution is within reach. You know, the technical solutions are within reach. It just takes strategic thinking about how we get out of that trap. So yes, we do need foreign currency reserves for strategic investments, but we're not going to do it by producing more watermelon and strawberries and extracting water resources while we're not actually securing our own nutrition, because we still have to borrow to continue importing wheat from abroad. I'll give you an extreme example, because this is not unique to Tunisia. One of the most extreme examples we have in Africa is Ethiopia, which is blessed by, you know, the most fertile land on the continent and the Nile River, right? All the water resources are available. Ethiopia today, the 3rd largest export revenue item is flowers for Valentine's, cut flowers for Valentine's, that they actually fly to Europe on Ethiopian Airlines on a daily basis, right? The most extractive thing. So the 3rd largest export revenue item is cut flowers, while at the same time, Ethiopia has 20 million people today who are dependent on food aid from abroad. That is, again, the most extreme, absurd misallocation of resources. Why does Ethiopia dedicate all of that logistics and infrastructure and to export flowers? Because they're desperate for those dollar revenues, because they're in a debt trap. Ethiopia, if you look at the last 20 years or so, at some point, Ethiopia uses up to 50% of its export revenues to pay interest on the debt. That's called the debt trap, right? And when you look at the entire African continent, with its relations with the global financial institutions over the last several decades, the fact that we're in a debt trap when these financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the rest of the global financial institutions, the fact that they literally dictate our domestic policy choices, economic policy choices, the fact that we're in a debt trap, even though they micromanage our choices, has got to mean one of 2 things. It means they're either completely incompetent and have no idea what they're dictating, right? And if you're incompetent, you should go away, right? Or it's actually intentional entrapment. And I believe it's the latter.
Okay.
Can I say something about wheat?
Yes, of course.
Here in Tunisia, we export about 70% of our needs in wheat. And the state owns about 400,000 hectares of land. So by the public policy only, we can produce enough wheat for people. Last year, we had a bread crisis here in Tunisia, and people had no access to bread, which is really horrifying in our country. So we are exporting two things mainly from this country. First, brains, because almost I think 30,000 doctors and their equivalent in engineers are exported mainly to northern countries. And we are exporting water-dependent products, while at the same time we are rationing water, or the government is rationing water. There are many paradoxes. Our environmental policy, NDCs, national determined contributions of the country, orients the economy to produce green energy to Europe. So it is a colonization policy imposed mainly from Europe and the international or the global actors like IMF, the World Bank, and the other strong actors in this world. In Tunisia, in 2011, there was a revolution between brackets, a revolution which put off the head of the state out of the country. But those who took the power are the same as those who pushed the country to its ruin. And the country is actually losing its better products, which means mainly brains. And this is horrifying for the future of our country, Tunisia.
Thank you. Then I have a very interesting remark of Rianne Verveen, one of the participants, who said that Ethiopia did export foods during the famine of 1984. Then I have a last question for both of you, if there are no other questions, and that's what's the fair story? I mean, what will, say, Dutch people or Tunisians no longer be able to obtain in their own country? So what should we sacrifice in order to come to more food sovereignty? What would be the impact on Europe, Western Europe? And how do you think we could sell this story? Maybe Fadhel, you can start.
I'm happy to start first with a few thoughts, and then Mohsen, you can come in. There's a couple of things to acknowledge, to recognize here, that Tunisia alone will not be able to offset the European Union Common Agricultural Policy. It's just not going to work. We're too small to undo massive agricultural subsidies, or the American subsidies, or the Japanese, or the Australian subsidies. So this has to be a global conversation, and this needs to involve, a counterbalance on our side, on our continent, in the context of something that will be, like the African Union Common Agricultural Policy, or at least regional economic blocks. In Africa, we have these regional economic communities. So something at that scale, with the complementarity of resources and capabilities, because no country can produce everything by itself. No country can get out of these structural traps by itself, certainly not a small country like Tunisia, with the current challenges of the external debt problem, with the droughts that we're experiencing. So we're all in this together, and we have to come out of this as regional communities, not as national priorities. It doesn't mean that in Tunisia we can't get started alone. As I said, we can produce 100 metric tons of wheat this next agricultural season. It's totally within reach. It's feasible, right? But it cannot happen when you have an entire administrative, political, technical edifice in our country that does not understand the difference between food security and food sovereignty, right? And when we have intentional pressure, and I say this from experience, intentional pressure and intervention in African Union meetings and international negotiations, when we as African and Global South civil society thinkers and scholars and experts try to push for the concept of food sovereignty and agroecology in official texts in international negotiations, that text gets changed and influenced by experts and policymakers in the global north who know exactly what food sovereignty means, who know exactly what food security means. They intervene and change the text to refer to food security when it comes to Africa and food sovereignty when it comes to Europe. It means they know exactly what they're doing. And I'm glad, Fayrouz, you mentioned this. I mean, the French Ministry of Agriculture, it's called the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. Same thing with the Italian Ministry of Agriculture. When we had the COVID, not the COVID crisis, the Ukraine supply chain disruptions that affected food supplies in the global south, especially in Africa, you can literally go back to the record and listen to the French Minister of Agriculture speaking to French public about the food disruption issues. And he's reassuring French consumers that they should not worry about this temporary disruption because France, like the rest of Europe, have systematically invested in our food sovereignty since the 1960s. Very clear explanation. And then he goes on to say that we have to intervene now and help and worry about our African friends who don't have food sovereignty. And then he moves on to say we need to secure their nutrition, changing the language very directly. So we have global leaders who know exactly what they're doing when it comes to the global food system. And that goes back to the intentional entrapment that I described. So we have to have an honest conversation about how do we rebalance, how do we fix this, in the context of food insecurity and the context of the climate crisis that is affecting the African continent in particular. So this is a question of ethical and moral priorities that need to be settled on a global scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen.
I can add just a few ideas in relation to European actors. It is important that people act in order to erase the illegitimate debt, which is really mainly with the European countries, and also to repatriate all the money which was put in European banks by the former dictator and his family. This is something that has not been done since 2011. Even many demonstrations asked for that. At the national level and also at the global level, we have to dismantle the UPOV. The UPOV is the organism dealing with the seeds and which forbids to peasants to exchange and to sell local seeds in their own countries. And there is a law in Tunisia forbidding to people to exchange local seeds. At another level, which is common to all of us, is to decolonize economy and to deal by our own minds, our own problems, in order to propose possible alternatives to this global economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mohsen. Thank you so much, Fadhel, too. I don't think there are any other questions. Then I will wrap up. Don't forget to note the next discussion initiated by the Green MENA Network. It will take place on 12th July on the same hour. And then we will start, when we talk about nature in Palestine. The registration of this conversation will be available on the YouTube channel of the Middle East platform. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.